Yes, so I'm an architect of sorts, and I design a whole range of things, often sort of platforms for participation. And I suppose I was asked to speak in this section to talk about my work. I was asked to talk about some of the projects that I do. But before I get into describing some of those projects, I wanted to talk a little bit more about why I do what I do, especially because in the program I'm called an artist, and it's not necessarily a label I usually put on myself. But looking at that label and looking at the title of the session, which is Playing the City, I think it's got something to do with, perhaps I'm inferring here that there's some joy in some of the work that I do. But I want to say that that joyfulness in the projects is completely unintentional. The work really, for me, doesn't have anything to do with joy. It has to do, very seriously, with power. And who has the power? Who designs and who decides? That's really what concerns me as an architect, thinking about the way the city is built, the way the city is designed, and the way it's inhabited. So in a sense, my work is about looking at this question of who's designing and who's deciding, and trying to step up that sort of meta ladder, if you like, to find out how I can create a framework that enables others to design or to be artists or architects or to make things or to create stuff. That's fundamentally what I'm interested in. And so, you know, how many people are familiar with the text Death of the Author? Do you know what I'm talking about here, more or less? So, you know, the 60s had this text, Death of the Author. The 90s had Death of the Architect. I think we're now going through Death of the Artist. And hopefully soon we'll have Death of the Algorithm. This is what I'm fundamentally interested in. So I'm going to talk a little bit about why I do what I do. I'm going to talk about then, you know, some of the actual projects and hopefully sort of finish off with some things that I've picked up along the way. So historically, the city is, I mean, this may well just be a myth, but the city has largely been designed by these sorts of genius master figures, architects, housemans, Frank Lloyd Wrights. They're almost always men deciding what is going to happen in the city and how it's going to happen. And my concern is that we have traded this kind of paternalism for the kind of paternalism of the control infrastructure, the data city. We've traded it for a kind of a paternalism of surveillance. So this is a shot from the control center in Rio, where all of the sensor data and all of the cameras and all of the sort of information from around the city streams in real time. It was helpfully put together with the cooperation, or shall I say the sort of financial cooperation of IBM. And of course, it's all about making the city more efficient, optimized, predictable, secure. And so in a sense, this control infrastructure is there to create what's known as the illusion of control. Now, in gambling, one of the things that seems to trigger addiction in gambling is this idea of the illusion of control. You think you can control the outcome, and you think, okay, because I haven't won in the last 10 rounds, I've got to win in the 11th. Somehow, we are almost designed to think that we're able to control our environment. So this is the smart city, this kind of attempt to sort of bring about what I would call a sort of a godlike fantasy upon the world, that we can know everything and we can control everything. This is the smart city. But this control infrastructure also has a button. So this is also the smart city, because there's a button to deploy the troops to go and clear the slums when they're just a little bit inconvenient. So when you think about the smart city as this, I want you to also think about the smart city as this, because they go hand in hand. This is part of the same thing. And when you think of the smart city as this, Remember that this is also the smart city. The NSA being able to access all of the data going through every home in the smart city and do whatever they want to with it. So the NSA is also the smart city. Ashley Madison leaking that data, that personal data, is also the smart city. Volkswagen falsifying the data is also the smart city. So when you think about that control room and you think about that attempt to try and make sense of the world, understand that these things go hand in hand when it's only a few people designing or deciding what happens with your data. So our decisions, the decisions that we make these days, and the technologies that enable us to make these decisions have an effect on way more people than they used to, have an effect on people far further away from you than they used to, and actually have an impact that lasts much longer than it used to. So the question of how we decide and who gets to decide is, I think, a fundamental one that we need to be thinking about as we go forward, especially because of things like this. So this is I don't know how to pause this video. This is a self-parking vehicle. It's a Volvo demonstration of a self-parking car in Portugal. So it's going to come in and park itself. So apparently somebody forgot to switch on the pedestrian safety function in this car. Now, what is most interesting is I want to play that again. And I want you to look at the people on the left who are standing right in front of the car, who are sort of observing it right there. Watch their response to the car. By the way, nobody had any long-lasting damage, so. They didn't even think to jump out of the way because they trusted that technology so much to do what it was expected to do. Because when we have these systems of control that are deployed to act on our behalf and make these decisions on our behalf, we start thinking that they can make better decisions than we can. And that, again, is a concern for me, because we start to think that we human beings are just what a Google engineer recently referred to as bugs in the system. So really, the concern I have is who designs these systems? Who decides these systems? Who designs IBM's model of optimization? Because none of us do, as far as I know. Who decides what is efficient in this smart city control room? And who determines what appropriate behavior is for us to nudge or to tilt towards? These are questions that I think we all have to be able to answer together. They cannot be answered on our behalf. We need to all be part of the process of trying to make sense of and respond to our cities and the future of our cities. And that's why I say that, the work I'm trying to do is not about joy and play. It's actually about trying to find ways for everyone to be part of the process of making decisions about the way they live their lives in their homes and their environments and their neighborhoods and their cities. It's fundamentally about building structures of participation. And ultimately, I would like to think that what I'm trying to do is create a sense of neighborhood in a context where the geographical neighborhood is kind of getting erased, where we sometimes feel closer to people that are on the other side of the world these days. So, I'm going to kick off actually with a project that I did here in Singapore back in 2006. And so I have a very deep affection for Singapore for helping me, helping give me the sort of context to give birth to this project. Was anybody at the Singapore Biennale opening party in 2006? Somebody was. Ah, okay. Were you there? Okay, good. So this project started with the notion of the beanstalk, Jack and the Beanstalk, and my question about how could ordinary members of the public be part of a process of assembling something, basically planting a seed somewhere and growing it to such a scale that it sort of exceeded their expectations of contributing to the scale of the city. And so we created this kind of modular carbon fiber and sensor and balloon system, which people could come along and start to assemble together into modules. This was on Padang. Assemble them, snap together the modules, inflate the balloons, and erect a structure that actually ended up being 18 stories tall. And there was an interactive handlebar along the bottom of this that responded to movement and shaking and triggered the colors that would then flow through this structure. The idea was that it was ordinary citizens creating a structure at the scale of basically the kind of the high-rises on the horizon. And this is now in London. This was a different version in London. And participating, even if only for a short time, in thinking about designing something for the city. And so it was actually my first kind of experiment in a way to build a framework for other people to design the kind of final thing. And the proof point was things like this for me. This was a blog post that somebody wrote about it, in which they referred to it and said, I feel proud to be able to say, hey, that's my baby up there. That really is the proof point for me. There was no mention of an art project or an artist even, or that this was somebody's project. It was my baby. And so I really love that. And then somebody else also sent in some scrapbook about their experience building it. Again, it's this idea of in some way enabling other people to take on some sense of ownership and responsibility and some sense of kind of agency, I suppose, in the city. Around the same time, I started working on a sort of sensor data infrastructure, which in 2008 launched as something called PatchBay or Pashubi or Pachibay or Pachubi. Everyone had a different pronunciation for it. Originally, it was just supposed to be an easy way for people to plug in sensors and then share that data between each other to build projects. Actually, originally, it was just for me and my friends to be able to create interactive projects that would respond to each other in different parts of the world. But by 2010, 2011, it had turned into quite a large-scale thing across the world, handling at one point 100 million data points per day from everything from air quality monitors to weather stations, seismographs. There were icebergs, satellites, ships. There were soil monitoring outposts. There was somebody who had actually taking sensor data from India to grow his chilies in Vancouver by mimicking the environmental conditions in real time. But the thing I wanted to talk about just very briefly, actually Alex touched upon earlier, which is what happened in Japan following the radiation crisis at Fukushima, which is that, as Alex mentioned, the government was not getting enough information out there about what was actually going on the ground with respect to the radiation. And we discovered on Twitter, actually just because my wife was Japanese, and so she could read this Japanese, there was a massive amount of discussion about all these feeds on PatchBay that were measuring radiation. And there were people basically sharing tutorials about how to plug in different Geiger counters and radiation monitors into PatchBay and sharing that data, some of which was updating once per second, where the government was only releasing data occasionally once per day, most likely once per week. And what was really interesting to me was, first, there was a huge amount of criticism about what was going on here. First, one of the criticisms was that this was dirty data. You know, it was uncalibrated. It was coming from sensors that we don't know what they are. We don't know what model type they are. They might be installed incorrectly. There were articles that were written about how it was unscientific and didn't enable anyone to create a sort of a valid data set. There was also criticisms about the fact that, that all the data was coming from one source, except that was because they were only searching in English, not in Japanese. And I think that all of these criticisms missed the point that what was going on here was a collective sense-making exercise where the individuals that were measuring were primarily concerned with whether the number goes up or down and where that number goes up or down, not to create some kind of big scientifically calibrated data set. So it was actually a way for people to, if you like, kind of recapture a sense of being able to do something in the context of not knowing what to do and being able to share that experience with others through this kind of measuring process. So what happened next was quite interesting. Alex mentioned Haiyan's project here, which took some of the feeds and actually compared them to pre-disaster levels and talked about the health effects, something that hadn't happened before. Actually talking about exposure rates and how important that was, not just the magnitude of the radiation. There were visualizations for trying to make sense of what was going on. There was the Winds of Fukushima Android app that took wind direction and wind speed and added in radiation data to predict where the radiation would peak next. There were forms for submitting radiation data if you didn't have an internet-connected device. There was an SMS alert that you could put onto your neighbor's radiation device if you didn't have your own, et cetera, et cetera. So this became this kind of collective sense-making exercise, which is, I think, important to understand. This was not about data, it was about measuring, and that's the important difference, I think. Linguini was a project for the city of Bradford, where originally I was commissioned to be a lighting designer. But when I got on the project, this was basically for the center of town. There was this new mirror pool park. They were getting rid of a bunch of roads and pedestrianizing everything. When I got on the project, I discovered that they'd planned to put in all of this technology, LEDs in the floor, lights, lasers, fountains, cameras, weather stations, and all this sort of urban furniture that was supposed to be interactive, but there was no program for what any of this stuff would do. And there was no way for the actual manager of the park to figure out how to control or manipulate any of these from any kind of in any kind of design sense. So what we ended up doing was basically creating a kind of an operating system for all of these bits of the built environment, gave everything an ID, and everything a way of conditionally triggering something else. So if you wanted to have the fountains respond to people walking, then you could connect the camera to the fountains, or you could have the lights following people, or have the fountains and the lights responding to the weather or to the local team when they score a goal. And so this was deployed in 2010. By the way, the local team doesn't score that often, so yes. And what we're actually doing now, hopefully over the next 6 or 9 months, is opening it up so that ordinary members of the public can use a mobile app to re-script the way all of these things respond to them. So it's not just about the city manager, or it's not just about designers that can kind of access this, to run their own kind of interactive projects on it. It's next about actually getting ordinary people re-scripting through a fairly simple drag and drop interface the way all these bits and pieces respond to them. Natural Fuse was a project from a while ago. It was a plant with a power socket on it, and it created a kind of a networked sequestering system. So Patch Bay was acquired by a US software company, and so I haven't had anything to do with it basically for the last 3 years. But now there are hundreds of platforms like Patch Bay once was. And so there is actually a whole heap of connected stuff out there, air quality monitors, weather stations, and what have you. And so with Thinkful, what we do is we go out and index all those different platforms, and we've created a search engine so that anyone can go and search for the data that they're looking for. So if you're interested in an air quality monitor, for example, you might not know about the Air Quality Egg Network or the AQICN network or the local authorities' air quality network, but you can just say, okay, what's near me? And it'll show you the actual sensors. So basically, I suppose the point of the projects is always to try and go one level above to think about what is the meta framework that one can create that enables, on the one hand, the most flexibility in people's participation, but on the other hand, is not so rigid as to close down the options. It's not so open that it makes people scratch their head and say, you know, what the hell do I do with this? But it still enables a sort of re-scripting of what it's meant to be. This is kind of, I suppose, a feature that goes through many of the different projects. And on that note, I will just leave it there. Thank you.